Chapter 2: The Three Levels of the Human Being. There is a readily identifiable hierarchy in the construction of the human being. Most basically, this hierarchy is characterized by three levels. 1. Mental/spiritual. 2. Emotional/psychic. 3. Physical, including sex, sleep, food, and 5 senses. These levels are not in reality separate and distinct, but rather there is a complete interaction between them. Nevertheless, the degree of health or disease of the individual can be evaluated from a survey of all three levels. This is a crucial determination for any health practitioner to be able to make, because it is essential for evaluating the progress of the patient. Of course, there are also hierarchies within these three basic planes. The hierarchies are illustrated in Figure 1 in a simplified 1 or 2-dimensional representation. The mental plane is seen to be the most central. The highest in the hierarchy, because on this level are the functions most crucial to the expression of the individual as a human being. The physical level, although important, is nevertheless listed as most peripheral, as least significant, that is, in the hierarchy. Figure 2 is a breakdown of Figure 1 into individual functions. Within each plane, there is a further hierarchy of individual functions. As the practitioner is concerned primarily with disease, the hierarchies listed in Figure 2 show a listing of the symptoms, which are the negative aspects of the corresponding functions. The precise listing is as yet preliminary. Much work needs to be done to refine our understanding of the various levels. Nevertheless, this approximation is useful clinically, and it can be verified and refined by detailed chronological history-taking, always focused on the whole being. In this chapter, an attempt will be made to describe the three levels in moderate detail, while further illustrations will be elaborated much more exhaustively as we progress through the book. Each description in the illustration should be considered to be composed of a particular symptom and its degree of intensity. In the diagram, the sequence of symptoms is listed with the supposition that they are of the same severity. In a given individual, of course, this is not the case. For example, irritability of degree A is of less severity to the patient's life than depression, also of degree A. A great irritability of degree X is of course worse than a depression of degree A. On the other hand, if a patient progresses from this state into one in which there is depression of intensity X, while irritability falls back to intensity A, an adverse direction has occurred in the patient's health. By combining both the hierarchical level on which the main disturbance rests and the intensity of the symptoms, it is possible to construct a rough idea of the center of gravity of a patient's illness. To the extent that both the level and intensity of symptoms progress upward in the diagram, i.e., more toward the center of the person's true being, there is an adverse implication for the person's health. To the extent that this center of gravity moves downward, i.e., more peripherally, there is progression toward greater health. This concept will be illustrated further in later chapters. Mental plane. The highest and most important level through which the human being functions is the mental and spiritual level. As a general definition for this plane, we can say, the mental plane of an individual is that which registers changes in understanding or consciousness. As discussed in the previous chapter, these changes are initiated by either internal or external stimuli, but they are registered on this plane of existence. It is on the mental level that an individual thinks, criticizes, compares, calculates, classifies, creates, synthesizes, conjectures, visualizes, plans, describes, communicates, etc. Disturbances of these functions in turn constitute symptoms of the mental illness. The mental level is the most crucial level for the human being. It is the mental and spiritual content of a person which is the true essence of that person. If the inner tools of attaining a higher consciousness are disturbed, the very central idea of the possibility of an evolution in consciousness is lost. Where then is the meaning of life? A person can continue to live, be happy, and be of creative service to others and to himself with a crippled body, the loss of limbs, or even the loss of sight or hearing. Many examples can be cited of people who were healthy on this level of existence, even though handicapped on one or more peripheral levels. There are well-known musicians today who are blind. Beethoven composed some of his most profound and powerful works after losing his hearing. One of the most revered and successful geniuses in astrophysics today is confined to a wheelchair, virtually paralyzed by a neurological ailment, unable to pronounce words clearly. Yet he has contributed an unprecedented amount of insights to his field since his affliction. Spiritual giants such as Ramana Maharishi and Ramakrishna had cancer without dimming their spiritual reality or the impact on their disciples. On the other hand, if there is a disturbance on the mental/spiritual plane, the person's very existence is threatened. Such is seen in conditions such as senility, schizophrenia, and imbecility. Although the physical body is the medium through which higher faculties can manifest themselves in this material world, its maintenance in health cannot become an end in itself. It is doubtful that anyone would claim that people have come into this life just to eat, to enjoy sex, and to acquire money and possessions. Even the most primitive men see a higher goal in life, leading them to value faith, which is a degree of understanding, and love. Take these away from even the most primitive person, and the will to live will be lost. If it were possible to have an absolutely healthy mind, we would see people who live continually in spiritual bliss, daily revealing new creative ideas expressed in a very clear way, always of service to others. Such people would be living constantly in the clearness of light and never in the confusion of spiritual darkness. From this state of absolute mental health to a state of total confusion of mind, we can discern a steady gradation of increasing confusion on the various sublevels of the mental plane. There is a hierarchy within mental functions, assuming conditions of equal intensity. We can see that a disturbance of memory is not as serious as an equal disturbance in the ability to concentrate. This is not as serious as the inability to discriminate and iterate. And this is not as serious as a disturbance in the ability to think. Understanding clearly such gradations is crucial for determining the prognosis in a given case. If we have a patient who has undergone treatment and progresses from slight degree of confusion to a greater degree, from slight disturbance of thinking to a greater one, then the patient's health has declined, even though a particular physical symptom may have been relieved. Far from being a mere academic observation, the suppression that can result from such thoughtless therapy can lead to a generalized breakdown in the health of the entire human race. It can be shown that in ancient times, the defense mechanism was better able to contain illness and repair injury than we see today. Nowadays, visits to doctors become commonplace at a young age. Consequently, large proportions of our populations are exposed from youth to suppressive therapies. This may well be the reason for the alarming rise during the past few generations of chronic disease, morbidity, and mortality rates. Even the spiritual chaos of our modern world may well be the result of this progression, created by continual suppressive treatments of increasingly powerful nature. James Tyler Kent, an American physician, in his Lesser Writings, summed up the tragedy in this way. Today, no skin eruptions is left to appear. Everything that appears on the skin is quickly suppressed. If that continues for long, the human race will disappear from the face of the earth. How then, when confronted with an actual patient, can we recognize clearly the degree of health or disease on the mental plane? We need to have a simple and obvious way of defining the qualities which describe the degree of mental health in an individual. As on all levels, health is not merely the absence of symptoms referring to particular mental functions. It is a state of being which can be described as having three fundamental qualities, each of which is indispensable for a true state of health. If any one of them is lacking, the mind may be functioning quite well in terms of mere functions, but may nevertheless be quite sick. The three indispensable qualities that should accompany the different functions of a mind are: number 1, clarity; number 2, rationality, coherence, and logical sequence; number 3, creative service for the good of others as well as for the good of one's self. All three of these qualities must be present, but the third is of prime importance. It is this quality of creative service which appears to be the least understood in modern allopathic medicine. Yet, the lack of this quality leads eventually to the worst states of insanity imaginable. Let us discuss few examples of how consideration of these mental qualities can provide the practitioner with a precise way of evaluating the mental health of the individual. First, we consider a person who can never express his thoughts clearly. He has great difficulty finding the right words. His thinking has become weak. We are seeing the beginning of disturbance which may eventually lead to a state of senility or imbecility. Another individual may have clarity but lacks coherence of thinking. He cannot express his thoughts in a logical manner and is therefore not understood by others. He has lost his capacity for abstract thinking. But perhaps even more importantly, he has become subject to impulses. He has become irrational. He jumps from subject to subject, perhaps brilliantly, but yet so rapidly that others are left mystified. The stereotype of the absent-minded genius is a good example of someone disturbed by the quality of coherence. Such a person is deeply disturbed on the mental level. Wow. The same applies to the master criminal who is highly intelligent and plans a theft or a murder with the utmost degree of clarity and rationality of thinking. Yet, this person is ill on the deepest regions of his being because he is pursuing selfish goals at the expense of other people. Such a mentality pervades our modern world to an extreme degree, and it is root cause of the problems of competition, violence, alcohol and drug abuse, poverty, and war. We have all known individuals who are highly egotistical and intolerant of the views of other people. Such a person believes that he is always right and no one knows better than he does. He therefore cannot accept any new ideas, even though they may be correct and beneficial. This leads to a state of mind which excludes the possibility of seeing the truth. In such an instance, The qualities of clarity and creative service are lacking and are preventing the full and proper use of his mental faculties. Progressively, such a person is prone to develop a state of delusion, a state in which the false appears to him to be true. In this way, the highly egotistical and selfish person paves the way for a state of confusion which may eventually lead to a state of actual insanity. We can see a similar process in a highly acquisitive individual. This person has great belief in material values. Nothing is more important than the possessions he desires to acquire, which may be objects or people. Such possessiveness may evolve into a driving desire so out of proportion to reality that the person may seek satisfaction at any cost. Exploitation of others or even harm to others will not be sufficient obstacles once the desire becomes obsessive. A person in this state has lost all idealistic and ethical values. What can be more insane than hurting or even killing fellow beings in order to attain some material gain? Besides, this eventually results in a state of great insecurity for the possessive person himself. If for some reason this person loses his possessions, the shock will be virtually unbearable. By contrast, a person who is more healthy in regard to this quality, upon losing his possessions, will suffer only temporarily and then move on harmoniously to make a new beginning. As we can see from such examples, there is a very fine line between what psychiatrists judge to be mental health and what they call mental illness. At what point in the above examples do these people cross the boundary between health and illness? Rather, there is a continuous gradation of mental degeneration starting from the selfishness and possessiveness and leading into what can eventually be clearly defined as insanity. Finally, let us consider the basic sources of mental and emotional suffering, which enable the initiation of psychosomatic illness in the first place. Psychosomatic perspectives have practically become a modern fad. We are aware, as are all modern physicians, that disturbing thoughts or feelings can disrupt very deeply the health of an individual. A sudden grief, a sudden fear, a sudden communication of bad news can throw the organism into extreme suffering that can unbalance the organism for the rest of its life. Why is it that some people can experience such shock for a brief time, but others degenerate into a chronic and deteriorating state of health? What are the qualities on the mental level which lead to the difference in susceptibility? If we meditate upon the source of mental or emotional suffering, it gradually becomes clear that such suffering arises from two basic sources: broken ambitions and broken attachments. These, in turn, are another way of saying selfishness and acquisitiveness. Anyone who believes strongly in many selfish ambitions is setting himself up for a lot of suffering. As soon as it becomes clear that an overly inflated ambition is unreachable, the person will experience grief proportional to the degree of his original belief in it. The same applies to a person driven by acquisitiveness. The degree of suffering resulting from loss of a possession is proportional to the degree of attachment to that possession. Thus, the conclusion can be drawn that if a person wishes to avoid mental and emotional suffering, he should cultivate selfless, humble, and altruistic qualities. This does not mean, however, that a person should become ascetic, refusing to meet the necessary needs required by every individual. The best policy to follow for maximizing health is the way of the golden mean of the ancient Greeks: neither too much nor too little, no excess. Such moderation applies equally to all three levels of human existence. The emotional plane. The level of human existence of next importance to the mental level is the emotional level. By this, we include all grades and shades of emotion from the most primitive to the most sublime. This level of existence acts as a defense mechanism's receptors of emotional stimuli from the environment, and also functions as the vehicle of expression for feelings, actions, and emotional disturbances occurring in the individual. The following is a definition of the emotional plane of existence. That level of human existence which registers changes in emotional states. The range of emotional expression can vary wildly. Love, hatred, joy, sadness, calmness, anxiety, trust, anger, courage, fear, etc. Thus, it is this level which is very close to the core of daily existence of every individual. Feelings as to their quality can be defined as positive or negative. Positive feelings are those tending to draw the individual towards a state of happiness. Negative feelings are those tending to draw the individual towards a state of unhappiness. The more an individual feels or experiences negative feelings, the more unhealthy he or she is on this level. To measure the degree of emotional disturbance of a person is to find out how much in his waking state he is occupied with negative feelings such as apathy, irritability, anxiety, anguish, depression, suicidal thoughts, jealousy, hatred, envy, and etc. The most healthy and emotionally evolved people experience some of the most profound states known to mankind. Mystical experiences, ecstasy, pure love, religious devotion, and a wide range of sublime feelings difficult to describe, and in our era, limited to only a small number of rare beings. As a generalization, it can be said that imbalances on the emotional plane manifest themselves as heightened sensitivity to the sense of ourselves as vulnerable beings separate from the rest of creation. Emotionally disturbed states tend to revolve around issues of personal comfort, personal survival, and personal expression. On the other hand, the most evolved emotional states tend to involve feelings of the oneness of ourselves with all creation, love, bliss, devotion, etc. Thus, positive feelings in an individual will always tend to create a sense of unification with the outside world. On the contrary, negative feelings will tend to produce a state of isolation and separation from the outside world. As we saw on the mental level, upon which a person can suffer from negative thoughts, so also on the emotional level, a person can have negative feelings, which create inner disturbance and disharmony with the environment. Positive feelings, on the contrary, strengthen the inner emotional state and create positive conditions in the environment which enhance communication with people and thereby serve the community. When someone expresses trust to another, this very act elevates both and creates a greater psychic equilibrium. By contrast, an expression of anger or mistrust creates a disharmonious emotional state in everyone's psyche, and in this way adds to the deterioration of the community. Someone who lives with feelings of inner calm, joy, euphoria, etc., provides for himself and others the best possible emotional nourishment, which can only enhance the level of emotional health. A person, on the other hand, who lives continually with anxiety, sadness, or fear provides poisonous food, which eventually leads to degeneration of health in himself and others. As on the other two levels, there is a hierarchy of emotional disturbances which can be graded according to the extent that they reach deeply into the individual or remain relatively on the periphery. The current approximation of this hierarchy is listed in Figure 2. Again, this is a rough approximation developed from past clinical experience and will undoubtedly be altered and refined by careful observers in the world over. At the boundaries of the emotional plane with the mental and physical planes, there is a certain amount of overlap as described in Figure 3. Still, within the emotional hierarchy itself, we see a gradation of symptoms which again is useful in determining whether a given patient's progress is improving or declining. For example, considering each symptom at equivalent degrees of intensity, depression can be seen to be more seriously limiting to the life of the patient than anxiety, and anxiety more severe than irritability. Comprehending the gradation of symptoms is helpful to the practitioner in determining in which direction the patient's progress is headed, but a quick guideline is needed with which to judge the degree of health or disease in an individual immediately at the first interview. At the high state of emotional health, the individual experiences an absolute dynamic calmness combined with love for self, others, and the environment. This is a state of serenity which is actively involved with people and the environment. It is not merely a lack of emotional feeling generated as a protection against emotional vulnerability. On the other hand, a person at the worst extreme of emotional health suffers severe internal anguish or depression of such intensity that all interest in life is lost and there is an active desire for death. In between these extremes, there are wide variations and individual modes of expression. In modern times, weakness on the emotional plane has become one of our major existing health problems, whether because of lack of understanding of the laws of nature or because of continuous therapeutic suppression of relatively peripheral ailments into the core of human existence. Many of the problems of today's world can be seen as arising from emotions which are imbalanced, misdirected, and destructive. Modern problems of indiscriminate warfare, random violence and terrorism in the cities, mass murders, racial oppression, and child abuse are all examples of mismanaged emotional states, both on the individual and societal levels. As described earlier, the human being both affects and is affected by the environment. On the emotional level, one of the major environmental influences is the almost complete failure of our educational systems to provide emotional training for young people. As a result, the emotional part in us remains undernourished and cachectic. Becoming easy prey to disease conditions. Throughout Western history, and especially in the present-day materialistic and technological era, education has focused almost exclusively on athletics, physical level, and intellectual training, mental level. The primary heroes of young people are athletically or intellectually successful classmates. Sensitive, artistic, musical, or poetic young people are rarely glorified or even encouraged. In modern life, the major source of emotional education appears to be television, which involves the viewer only passively and emphasizes exaggerated or fantasized perspectives on life. Education should follow a more natural procedure based on known stages of maturation. The emphasis of education should be placed on the development of the physical body between the ages of 7 and 12, of the emotions between the ages of 12 and 17, and of the mental level between the ages 17 and 22. Instead, our education is haphazard and random, often governed by political influences more than by recognition of the natural stages of development of the students. The result is the creation of graduates from school who are imbalanced and weakened on the emotional level. Although it is beyond the purpose of this book to fully delineate recommendations for changing the educational system, it is nevertheless important to the practitioner to understand the profound influence which this education inadequacy has on the health of the emotional plane of the individual. Between the ages of 12 and 17, the human being experiences a natural awakening of the sexual instincts and also of the highest cause there is no programmed and also between the ages of 12 and 17, the human being experiences a natural awakening of the sexual instincts and also of the highest emotional feelings, appreciation of love, freedom, justice, etc. Because there is no programmed education to mobilize and develop these feelings, they get channeled through experiences which are bewildering, frustrating, and often humiliating to the young person. Early attempts to express and act upon these emotions are labeled by teachers and parents alike as rebellious, dreaming, overly idealistic, or even irrational. Healthy emotional expressions are downgraded and criticized, while the educational emphasis is on conformity, normality, and success in competition with others. Usually, what then happens is that young people channel all their emotional experiences into sex and immediate gratification of pleasure, which in turn often lead to experiences which are called illicit or degrading. The final result is that young people go through strongly disappointing experiences which harden their emotions or sometimes deaden them completely. The need for emotional expression then becomes channeled into distorted goals. In this way, we witness eventually the emergence of the hard-headed, competitive businessman who is ruthless and indifferent to other people's feelings. People with inadequate emotional training enter marriages for which they are unprepared, a situation leading to our high divorce rate. Parents faced with the unexpectedly great responsibility of having children see them as objects or as projections of their own frustrated goals in life. Consequently, we end up with a society made up of people who are out of touch with their feelings and incapable of handling themselves maturely whenever they do erupt. From the emotional standpoint, we can say that we have today a society of people dead at 25, though living to 75. Education would recognize the need for idealistic and aesthetic feelings which emerge naturally at school age. When love, friendship, and companionship, altruistic feelings, and sacrifice are expressed, they should be praised, encouraged, and channeled into mature directions rather than being either ignored or criticized. Natural inclinations towards music, poetry, and art should be specifically rewarded and developed under discriminating direction. Excursions to spots of natural beauty should be commonplace. Even religious and spiritual discussions should be available to students, and meditation techniques of various types should be offered to students with such interests. Between the ages of 12 and 17, the emphasis in education should be on creativity rather than conformity, aesthetic rather than merely intellectual values, and inspirational rather than solely practical development. If education were to be improved in this way, the result would be people who are mature and balanced on the emotional level, and therefore much less susceptible to diseases on this level. Marriage and family life would become stabilized and fulfilling rather than stressful and morbific. Stresses of life and the environment would then not so easily gravitate towards weakness of the defense mechanism on the emotional plane, thus preventing the modern epidemics of nervousness, insecurity, violence, anxiety, fear, and depression. The physical plane. The physical level of existence is the part of the human organism with which medicine has traditionally occupied itself. It has been researched in depth through anatomy, physiology, pathology, biochemistry, molecular biology, etc. However, there is a singular fact which appears to have not become evident to most physicians despite all this research, that the human body in its complexity maintains a hierarchy of importance of its organs and systems. One can only conjecture as to why this concept of hierarchy has been ignored in allopathic literature, but it would seem likely that the primary reason is that such a concept is not needed in allopathic approach to treating disease. Nevertheless, a full comprehension of this perspective is absolutely necessary for the practitioner dealing with the patients as a totality. As always, in considering the gradation of systems in the physical body, we first must recognize the tentative nature of the precision of the details until confirmed by further observation. The following principles will help us to elucidate the hierarchy. Number 1. If a given system contains an organ of central importance for maintaining a full sense of well-being, that system should be graded according to the importance of that organ to the entire organism. Number 2. The relative grading of importance of an organ can be measured by the degree of damage to the organism produced by a particular amount of injury to that organ. For example, a scar on the brain will have a more damaging effect than an equal-sized scar on the heart or on the skin. Following a list of systems under consideration and their organs listed approximately in order of importance to the organism. Number 1 is the nervous system, which includes brain, spinal cord, ganglia, and plexuses, and peripheral nerve fibers. 2, the circulatory system, which includes heart, blood vessels, the blood itself, lymphatic vessels, and the lymph. 3, the endocrine system, which includes pituitary gland, thyroid and parathyroid glands, adrenal glands, islets of Langerhans, ovaries and testes, and pineal gland. Number 4 is the digestive system, which consists of liver, pancreas, and alimentary canal with its accessory glands. 5, the respiratory system, which consists of lungs, bronchi, trachea, pharynx, and nose. 6, the excretory system, which consists of kidneys, ureters, bladder, and urethra. Gosh, this 7, the reproductive system, which consists of the testes, seminal vessels, penis, urethra, prostate, and bulbourethral glands in the male, and the ovaries, fallopian tubes, uterus, vagina, and vulva in the female. 8 is the skeletal system, which includes bone, connective tissue, and joints. 9 is the muscular system, which consists of striated muscles and non-striated muscles. In this classification, we see that the first 4 systems, the nervous, circulatory, endocrine, and digestive, the first 4 systems listed contain one organ each which is vitally important to maintain life. First the brain, then the heart, then the pituitary gland, then the liver. In these systems, there is one organ that is predominant and whose function cannot be duplicated by other equal or similar organ. As we look further down the list, we see systems which have two equally efficient organs, each capable of functioning for both. 2 lungs, 2 kidneys, 2 reproductive organs in both male and female. Still further down the hierarchy, we find the skeletal system, the central part of which is the vertebral column, consisting of many vertebrae. Several of these can be damaged without causing death. The same is true of the muscular listed last. The hierarchy of physical systems can be considered in a different light by asking the question, how much damage to a particular organ or system is required to impair life? On the muscular level, it would require a systematic myopathy affecting nearly all of the muscles to impair life significantly. Somewhat less damage, but still quite extensive, would have to be done to the vertebral column to destroy life. As we go higher in the hierarchy, we see that it requires progressively smaller and smaller amounts of destruction to the primary organ of each system to endanger the life of the organism. Of the organs most vital to the organism, quite small areas of damage are required to create very serious problems. An area of ischemia on the heart produces more damage to health than a similar area in the liver or kidney, but is still less threatening than similar damage in the brain. From these observations, we can construct a hierarchy of organs in the physical body based on their importance in the organism to the organism. Number 1, brain, one of it. Number 2, one heart. Number 3, one pituitary gland. Number 4, 1 liver. Number 5, 2 lungs. Number 6, 2 kidneys. Number 7, 2 testes or ovaries. Number 8, we have 28 vertebrae. Number 9, many muscles. Understanding this hierarchy is not a mere academic exercise. It enables the practitioner to recognize the direction of progression of illness. If disease is progressing upwards in the hierarchy from kidneys, lungs, pituitary, heart, and finally brain, it is clear that progress is going in an adverse direction. On the contrary, if the progression is downward from the brain toward the muscle, there is clearly improvement occurring in the general health. If a modern physician observes a particular patient progressing, for example, from eczema to bronchial asthma, he is likely to explain this to the patient in one of 2 ways. Either it is the natural course of the disease in allergic individuals, or the asthma is an unfortunate but coincidental second ailment added to the eczema. If a patient who has suffered from rheumatoid arthritis later has a heart attack, the doctor will consider both events as separate and coincidental and will treat them separately. Even more unfortunately, the deeper the organ involved, the more likely the physician will be to give a more toxic drug to control the symptoms, if indeed one has yet been invented. The patient with rheumatoid arthritis will likely be given aspirin or butazolidine, and after the heart attack, he may receive digitalis, quinidine, propranolol, or anticoagulants as well. Sorry. It is not considered possible by the allopathic profession that progressively more serious ailments may be the result of suppression of symptoms of less serious ailments, regardless of whether the method of therapy being used is artificial or so-called natural. If an adverse direction in the hierarchy occurs after the treatment, it must be suspected that the therapy is doing harm and it should either be discontinued or changed. The definition and measure of health. Thus far, we have tried to consider in some detail the human organism in its setting of environmental influences and on its three levels of function. Necessarily, this approach presents a somewhat fragmented picture of the human being. In fact, of course, the human organism is a completely integrated totality, always acting with innate intelligence to maintain homeostasis with varying degrees of success. Now we will attempt to pull together this fragmented image and illustrate with examples how these concepts can be used by practitioners to precisely evaluate the state of health of a given individual. As we have seen, there is a hierarchical gradation of functions and disturbances within the human organism which tends to maintain order. This hierarchy is not merely limited to living entities, it is a characteristic of structure and function of the universe itself. For instance, a sudden disturbance in the laws of attraction and repulsion of electromagnetic fields would create unimaginable destruction in the cosmos. A fundamental, even momentary, change in the activity of the sun would profoundly disrupt life on Earth. Even small changes in the temperature range of the planet drastically alter the balance of life forms. On a lesser scale, the gravitational force of the moon affects life, as do humidity, wind, and local climatic conditions. In all of these phenomena, we can discern a hierarchy of functions and the laws governing their interactions. If a central process of fundamental importance is disturbed, even slightly, the effect upon the whole system is much greater than would occur if a lesser process were disturbed to the same degree. As we have already seen, such a small area of damage to the brain has far more effect on the organism than a similar area of damage on the skin. The idea of hierarchy is actually the idea of the oneness from which all else has been created. All entities and all levels are connected throughout the universe by this concept. Therefore, it can be considered a universal law. The concept of hierarchy gains tremendous practical importance to the clinician upon consideration of the center of gravity of action or disturbance in the organism. In our era, it can be said from a practical point of view that every individual, viewed as a totality, at every moment of his life is ill to some degree. The extent of the disease is determined by the totality of the disturbance existing as symptoms on all three levels. A visible disturbance on one level, no matter how minute, simultaneously affects other levels as well, though to a greater or lesser degree. Nevertheless, when the greatest part of symptoms is on one level, we can say that the center of gravity of the disturbance at that moment is on that level. This is a highly dynamic state, of course, but the practitioner can in general discern a basic center of gravity of disturbance upon taking a careful history which includes all three levels of the individual. Let us take as an example a patient who suffers with bronchial asthma and chronic constipation as the chief complaints in his physical body. After taking a careful history at all levels, it becomes clear that he is also quite irritable. He has a fear of the dark, a fear of disease, and anxiety about his future. Upon even further inquiry, he admits that he has lived for some time with the fact that his power of concentration has diminished. At this moment, as determined by the intensity of the chief complaint, the clinician perceives that the center of gravity of symptoms is on the physical plane. The practitioner prescribes a course of therapy, whether allopathic medicine, psychotherapy, naturopathic treatments, and on the return visit discovers that the asthma and constipation have been ameliorated satisfactorily, while the symptoms of irritability and anxiety have increased. The patient complains of sadness, and his mental state exhibits further deterioration in his power to concentrate. His ability to perform creative work for himself or others is lessened to a noticeable degree. The orthodox allopathic doctor, focused by training on the physical level, would be likely to feel gratified by the results since the asthma and constipation have improved, and then refer the patient to a psychiatrist to handle the new psychological problems. A practitioner who understands the principle of the totality of the patient, however, would immediately see that the center of gravity of disturbance has moved from the physical to the emotional level, thus signifying a deterioration of health in general, despite the fact that the original physical complaints may have been 90% ameliorated. Diminished, that is. During a real cure, the exact opposite sequence of events is likely to occur. At first, the physical symptoms may remain unchanged or perhaps grow slightly worse, while the power of concentration is improved and emotional symptoms are diminished. This would mean that the center of gravity is gradually lowering in the hierarchy and concentrating somewhat on the physical plane. The wise clinician would simply do nothing at this point, and on subsequent visits, it will be observed that all of the symptoms, including the physical ones, have gradually disappeared. Thus, by understanding the hierarchy of symptoms and observing the change in the center of gravity, we have a highly practical method of evaluating progress, a method which is based, moreover, on the actual workings of the defense mechanism of the organism. Throughout the presentation thus far, we have mentioned two factors for consideration: the location in the hierarchy of the symptoms and their intensity. For example, patients can have a spectrum of symptoms identical to those of the above patient, both with the same center of gravity, yet one may experience only slight impairment of his health, while the other may be severely crippled by disease. Such a difference results from the difference in intensity of symptoms. For this reason, we need a device for measuring readily both the overall degree of health of the individual as well as a measure of the intensity of individual symptoms. Such a measure arises from the fundamental definition of health. According to what has so far been said, it is easy to define the state of health of an individual. A comprehensive definition must fit the entire scope of the human being as a spiritual being. People throughout their lifetimes do little else than to free themselves from the bondage that pain creates in the body, that passions create in the emotion, and that selfishness creates in the spirit. The clinician who understands the objective of the healer's mission must try to lead the patient toward greater freedom from these three limitations. Every pain, every discomfort, every weakness appearing in the body inevitably limits whatever freedom existed before the symptoms appeared. Therefore, the state of disease is bondage, a slavery of the body. Nearly everyone, however, at least for a brief moment in life, has experienced complete freedom of body function, when none of the organs are limited and when there is no sense of negative awareness of the body. Thus, the state of physical health can be defined as follows. Health in the physical body is freedom from pain, having attained a state of well-being. On the emotional or psychic level, As long as a person is serene and calm, he can proceed without restriction in creative work, both for himself and for others. From the moment passion appears and takes hold of the individual, there occur anxiety, anger, anguish, fear, fanaticism, etc. Such passion tends to enslave the emotional parts of an individual, and it prevents free functioning in other realms. This is true even for idealistic passions which approach fantasism in intensity. For any excessive passion tends to enslave. Any passion prevents the person from being the master of himself. So we can define the state of health on the emotional level in this way. Health on the emotional level is living a state of freedom from passion. Wow. Having as a result of dynamic serenity. Having as a result dynamic serenity. In this definition, it must be made very clear that the emphasis is on dynamics. This is not merely a condition of lack of feeling arising out of intellectual disciplines designed to control emotion. It is rather a state of being capable of freely feeling the full range of human emotions without being enslaved by them from moment to moment. In an analogous manner, when there arise selfish tendencies and acquisitive desires, a state of pain is experienced. The selfish person is one who is diseased in the deepest strata of being, in proportions to the intensity of the egotism. All of us have known highly selfish people who are easily hurt by events which run counter to their wishes. To the degree that a person governed by selfish ambition and acquisitiveness, he or she approaches a state of mental illness that can end in total confusion. Hence, this definition, health on the mental plane, is freedom from selfishness, having as a state complete unification of the person with the divine or with truth, and whose actions are dedicated to creative service. In this way, we summarize the definition of health of the whole being as follows. Health is freedom from pain and the physical body having attained a state of well-being, freedom from passion on the emotional level having as a result a dynamic state of serenity and calm, and freedom from selfishness in the mental sphere having as a result total unification with truth. Capital T. The question naturally arises at this point. How do we measure the comparative degree of health of any individual at any given moment? What is the parameter that defines, for instance, whether an individual with rheumatoid arthritis is better in health than other one suffering with depression? The parameter which enables such measurements of health is creativity. By creativity, I mean all those acts and functions which promote for the individual himself and for others their main goal in life, continuous and unconditional happiness. To the extent that an individual is limited in the exercise of his creativity, to that degree he is ill. If the rheumatoid arthritis patient is crippled to the extent that his ailment prevents him from being creative more than the patient with the depression, then the rheumatoid arthritis patient is more seriously ill than the depressed one, even though the center of gravity is on a lower hierarchical level. Having the idea of creativity in mind, one can always deduce the degree of health or disease of an individual at any given moment. Summary of Chapter 2. 1. The mental level of being is the most crucial for the individual's existence and maintains within itself a hierarchy very useful for evaluating the progress of a patient. 2. A healthy mind should be characterized in its functions from the following 3 qualities: clarity, coherence, creativity. To the extent that any or all of these qualities are reduced or missing, the person is ill at the corresponding level. 3. Confusion, disunity, and distraction constitute the qualities of a completely diseased mind. 4. The practice of selfishness and acquisitiveness are the primary factors that derange the mind. Freedom from selfishness and acquisitiveness will naturally lead to a healthy state of mind. Summary of the emotional plane section. 1. The emotional plane of the human being is next in importance to the mental one. This plane is ill to the extent that the person maintains within himself, is trapped by and expresses negative feelings as envy, jealousy, anguish, fanaticism, sadness. If the individual can free himself from such passions, then he can be healthy on this level. 2. On this level arise anxiety, anguish, irritability, fears, and phobias, and depression, so common in our times. Our educational and political systems have never systematically developed the emotional plane, which is generally weak, undernourished, and therefore vulnerable. 3. There is a hierarchy of symptoms within this level that is useful as a measure of progress during therapy. Summary of physical plane section. 1. The physical body and its organs constitute the least important plane of the human being. The body also maintains hierarchy of importance to its organs and functions. An infarct of the brain will be of more importance than an infarct of the heart, and this in turn is of more importance than a thrombosis of an artery in the leg. 2. The organism will always try to keep disturbances away from important organs. 3. A disturbance that progresses during any treatment from less important organs to more important organs signifies a deterioration in general health. An opposite direction of progress indicates progress towards a better state of health. Sorry about that. And that is the end of chapter 2.